Hello, my friends. What we are witnessing at this stage of the Ukraine conflict is not a series of isolated escalations, but the gradual collapse of the international order that the United States and its allies claim to defend. The situation today must be understood as a convergence of maritime confrontation, covert warfare, economic coercion, and a rapidly deteriorating military balance inside Ukraine itself. Recent actions by the United States in the Caribbean illustrate how far Washington is now prepared to go. The seizure of an oil tanker flying the Panamanian flag, apparently owned by Chinese interests and carrying Venezuelan oil to China, marks a significant escalation. This was not a sanctioned vessel. The oil was legally purchased. The cargo belonged to Chinese entities. In effect, the United States has crossed the line and begun direct interference with China's energy imports. That is not enforcement of sanctions. That is economic warfare. Claims that this seizure was accidental or that U.S. authorities were unaware of Chinese ownership are not credible. The pattern is too clear. Western interference with Russian oil shipments, drone attacks on tankers connected to Russian ports, and now interference with China-bound energy shipments all point to a broader strategy. As Brian Berletic previously observed, the harassment of Russian oil tankers increasingly resembles a rehearsal for wider maritime blockades. If Beijing is not already asking itself whether this is the opening phase of a broader confrontation, it soon will be. Russia has not been passive in response. Moscow has begun taking concrete countermeasures to protect its maritime trade. Ship owners are being encouraged to re-register vessels under the Russian flag, enabling naval escort and convoy protection. There are reports, unconfirmed but plausible, that armed security teams are being deployed aboard tankers to defend against aerial and underwater drone attacks. Whether these reports are entirely accurate is less important than how they are being weaponized politically. Western governments are already using the mere suggestion of armed crews as justification for boarding and seizing vessels, as seen recently off the coast of Sweden. This expanding assault on maritime commerce has profound implications. It no longer targets only sanctioned states like Venezuela or Iran, both of which have their own history of tanker seizures. It now directly affects Chinese trade and Russian exports. Drone attacks on Russian ports continue, though they appear tactically insignificant. These are pinprick strikes, symbolic rather than decisive, but symbolism matters in escalation dynamics. Russia and China will respond. Russia already has. China almost certainly will. Beijing possesses the world's largest navy by numbers and has begun deploying increasingly capable vessels, including newly launched supertankers. If Chinese trade comes under sustained threat, convoy protection becomes a rational response. China also has other tools, including restrictions on rare earth exports that could impose serious economic costs on the West. This is why rhetoric from figures like Senator Lindsey Graham is so dangerous. His public calls for seizing Russian oil tankers on the high seas betray a complete lack of strategic restraint. For him, escalation appears to have no ceiling. There is no reverse gear, only acceleration. Such thinking ignores the obvious consequence: naval confrontations, economic retaliation, and the erosion of global trade law. The so-called rules-based international order rests fundamentally on maritime trade norms established through institutions like the World Trade Organization. Those rules are being shredded. Ships are seized without due process. Ownership is ignored. Legal pretexts are retrofitted after the fact. Once this precedent is normalized, no trading nation is safe. China, however, is not isolated. Its strategic partnership with Russia provides it with secure access to food, energy, and raw materials. Contrary to Western narratives, Russia is not economically dependent on China in any existential sense. Russia is a continental, resource-rich, largely self-sufficient economy. It produces its own food and energy. It maintains domestic industrial capacity, including limited, high-end semiconductor production sufficient to sustain military industries. Where necessary, Russia can access international black markets, as states under sanctions always have. China, by contrast, is deeply integrated into global trade and heavily dependent on imports of raw materials. That is precisely why the Sino-Russian partnership matters. Russia provides energy, food, and strategic depth. China provides industrial goods, investment, and technology. Together, they reduce each other's vulnerability. Europe and, to a lesser extent, the United States are far more exposed to disruptions in global trade than their leaders care to admit. If maritime conflict escalates, if merchant vessels are routinely seized, undersea infrastructure sabotaged, and naval escorts normalized, the Western economies will discover how fragile their supply chains truly are. Alongside this economic confrontation, a parallel escalation is underway in what can only be described as a dirty war. Over recent weeks, Russia's Federal Security Service has reported the arrest of multiple sabotage cells operating inside Russia, allegedly directed by Ukrainian intelligence, with Western support. These reports include attempted assassinations and infrastructure sabotage. The scale and frequency suggest a systematic campaign. That assessment was reinforced by a major incident in Moscow, the assassination of Lieutenant General Safronov, head of Russia's military training systems. An explosive device planted in his vehicle killed him shortly after detonation. Safronov was a senior member of the Russian General Staff, though not directly involved in operational planning in Ukraine. His killing represents a significant escalation. The Kremlin is treating the incident with utmost seriousness. President Putin has been briefed. Investigations are underway. While official attribution has not yet been announced, the context makes it difficult to avoid the conclusion that this was part of the ongoing covert war. The Russian leadership will respond if it determines Ukrainian involvement or even plausibly concludes that such involvement existed. Meanwhile, Western intelligence agencies appear to be expanding cyber operations against Russian civilian infrastructure. Reports in Western media suggest hacking campaigns framed as retaliation for alleged Russian hybrid actions. Whether these attacks have achieved anything substantive is unclear, but the intent is unmistakable. Statements by the head of Britain's MI6 invoking the legacy of World War II-era sabotage organizations were deeply alarming. Whatever her intent, such rhetoric is bound to be interpreted in Moscow as confirmation of British involvement in covert operations. Her subsequent call with Russia's foreign intelligence chief may have been an attempt to contain the damage, to reassure Moscow that Britain does not seek uncontrolled escalation. If so, it was overdue. But reassurance alone will not reverse momentum. Russia perceives itself under direct attack, economically, militarily, and covertly. It will act accordingly. On the battlefield, the situation for Ukraine continues to deteriorate. Russian forces are advancing across multiple fronts. Supply routes in the Odessa region are increasingly constrained, with damaged bridges replaced by vulnerable ferry crossings. Energy infrastructure strikes continue. Russian gains in Zaporizhzhia, Sumy, and Kharkov regions are expanding pressure on Kiev itself. Urban strongholds, like Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, are being steadily reduced. Ukrainian mapping projects now show shrinking areas of control. Reports from Russian and Ukrainian sources alike confirm the loss of key villages. Claims in Western media that Russian advances are merely raids or kidnappings defy logic and serve propaganda, not analysis. At the political level, Kiev faces mounting internal strain. U.S. funding is drying up. European support has hit financial limits. The much-discussed European loan package is smaller and more conditional than expected. Corruption investigations into Zelensky's inner circle are resurfacing. Russian intelligence reports, clearly designed to sow panic, suggest elite flight and capital transfer. While exaggerated, these claims resonate because the underlying fear is real. Diplomatic efforts between Moscow and Washington appear stalled. Public statements by U.S. officials acknowledge deep disagreements over territory, nuclear facilities, minority rights, and sovereignty. Privately, even Ukrainian officials concede the likelihood of losing Donetsk, yet refuse to withdraw. This contradiction reveals the central truth. Ukraine no longer controls its own strategic destiny. Attempts by Western media to rewrite the origins of the war, suggesting Putin sought total conquest from the outset, collapse under scrutiny. The historical record shows early Russian efforts at negotiation, including immediate talks in Belarus and Istanbul and direct communication urging Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass. These facts contradict the maximalist narrative now being promoted, which explains why that history must be erased. The reason is simple. Some actors cannot tolerate even the possibility of U.S.-Russian accommodation. They fear any outcome short of Russian defeat. As negotiations stagnate, they resort to escalation, assassinations, sabotage, maritime seizures, and information warfare. This is what endgames look like. The losing side becomes reckless. Risks are multiplied. Rational calculation gives way to desperation. History shows that such moments are the most dangerous. Russia, for its part, has options, capabilities, and strategic depth. If this conflict continues to escalate, Moscow will not be the first to collapse. The greater danger lies in Western capitals that have lost the ability or the willingness to de-escalate. Whether this spiral can still be arrested remains uncertain. What is clear is that the current trajectory leads not to Ukrainian victory, but to broader confrontation. Cool heads are required. At present, they appear in short supply. Russia doesn't need to race toward an ending, because time, cold, industrial, mathematical time, is now working in Moscow's favor. This is the part Western capitals still refuse to accept. Wars don't end when a slogan wins the news cycle. They end when one side can no longer replace what it's losing. Men, ammunition, air defenses, power stations, money, political legitimacy. Ukraine is bleeding across all 5 categories at once, and the West is trying to compensate with 2 tools it still has in abundance: narrative and escalation. That's why you see the push toward maritime seizures, sabotage, cyber attacks, and assassination-style pressure. When the front line won't produce the breakthrough you promised your public, you try to manufacture leverage somewhere else on the seas, in the shadows, through economic strangulation. That isn't strategy. It's a confession. And here's the core reality, stated plainly. The United States and NATO can't simply stop, because stopping would force them to admit what they did, what they spent, and what they destroyed for an outcome they cannot deliver. They can't stop because their entire model of power depends on the assumption that the West is allowed to escalate indefinitely while others are required to absorb and submit. They can't stop because the moment they do, the spell breaks. Partners become customers, allies become accountants, and the rules-based order reveals itself as selective enforcement wrapped around naval supremacy. A system like that doesn't de-escalate gracefully. It either dominates or it fractures. Russia, meanwhile, doesn't need to gamble. Russia needs to grind. It doesn't have to win every headline. It has to win the ledger. It has strategic depth, energy, food, domestic production capacity, and most importantly, an opponent whose war effort is financed from outside. That's the Achilles heel. Ukraine can fight bravely, but bravery doesn't print artillery shells. Bravery doesn't replace transformers. Bravery doesn't rebuild bridges or keep the lights on when the grid is systematically degraded. The longer this goes, the more Ukraine becomes a function of Western budgets and Western political moods, both of which are shifting and neither of which Kiev controls. That's why the most tragic sentence in this entire war is also the most accurate. Ukraine is the only party without decision-making power. It can refuse territorial compromise today, but it cannot change the battlefield math tomorrow. It can demand security guarantees, but it cannot force Washington or Brussels to risk direct war with Russia to provide them. It can announce red lines, but it cannot enforce them. Kiev can continue fighting, but it cannot decide the conditions under which fighting ends, because the resources that sustain the war are increasingly external, and the realities that dictate the war are increasingly Russian. Now look at the escalation spiral forming in plain sight. Maritime seizures widen from sanctioned ships to ships that simply carry the wrong cargo to the wrong destination. The covert war intensifies sabotage networks, assassination attempts, cyber strikes because the conventional battlefield won't deliver the miracle. Western intelligence rhetoric flirts with historic sabotage doctrines as if the past can be reenacted safely. This is the logic of an empire that believes friction is something it can export without paying the bill. But friction accumulates. It creates countermeasures. It hardens resolve. It changes doctrine. And eventually, it produces miscalculation. If the West continues treating global trade as a weapon, seizing ships, interfering with energy flows, normalizing piracy by another name, it should not be surprised when the targeted powers respond in kind. Convoys appear. Escorts appear. Incidents occur. Markets panic. Insurance rates surge. And the fantasy that the Western public can live inside a permanent crisis without consequences finally collapses. The most dangerous phase of this conflict isn't a dramatic battlefield maneuver. It's the slow normalization of actions that make direct state-to-state clashes more likely. Ships boarded, drones launched, cables cut, ports hit, retaliation promised, retaliation delivered. So the end doesn't arrive with a heroic flourish. It arrives with recognition. The recognition that Ukraine cannot restore what it has lost by fighting longer. The recognition that Europe cannot subsidize indefinitely what it cannot industrially support. The recognition that Washington cannot police the planet while its own internal cohesion is cracking. And most crucially, the recognition that Russia is not going to blink simply because Western politicians need a victory narrative to survive the next election cycle. That is where this is going. Not toward the fairy tale of Russian collapse, but toward a negotiated outcome shaped by facts on the ground, facts created by Russian advances, Ukrainian exhaustion, and Western limitation. The only question is how much damage will be done before the people with microphones finally admit what the people with maps already know. And when the dust settles, the world will remember something else. The countries that shouted loudest about rules were the first to tear them up. They will remember who treated trade as sacred and who treated it as a choke chain. They will remember who escalated in the shadows when they couldn't win in the open. And they will remember that Russia didn't need to conquer the world to win this conflict. It only needed to withstand the pressure, outlast the theatrics, and let reality do what reality always does, punish delusion. That is the cold ending that no amount of propaganda can soften. America and NATO cannot stop because stopping is admission. Russia does not need to hurry because time is a weapon, and Ukraine, tragically, is the battlefield where other powers argue while its own choices narrow to almost nothing. There are voices in the United States today that are so detached from strategic reality that they actively sabotage any possibility of a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine. These voices do not merely misunderstand the conflict, they deliberately construct conditions that guarantee its continuation. One of the most prominent of these figures is Jack Keane, who routinely appears on American television, presenting himself as a sober military realist while advocating proposals that are, in fact, strategically absurd and diplomatically impossible. Keane recently laid out what he described as a framework for a negotiated settlement. According to him, such a settlement would require comprehensive security guarantees involving the United States, Ukraine, and Europe. What does that mean in concrete terms? It means American command and control over a multinational force with air, land, and sea components. It means foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, Western air power operating overhead, and naval forces patrolling the Black Sea. This apparatus, he claims, would enforce peace and deter Russia from ever acting again. Let us be absolutely clear about what is being proposed. This is not a peace settlement. This is the permanent institutionalization of the very conditions that caused the war in the first place. Keane is advocating for NATO by another name, embedded inside Ukraine, backed by American power, and granted de facto authority to define and adjudicate future conflicts. He presents this as a reasonable demand that Russia should accept as part of ending the war. That alone tells you everything you need to know about the sincerity of this proposal. Russia will never agree to it. No rational state, especially one that holds military, industrial, and strategic superiority, would ever consent to a settlement that cements its adversary's military presence on its doorstep under the guise of peace enforcement. And Keane knows this. The Europeans know this. Washington knows this. And that is precisely the point. Any negotiated settlement requires concurrence from all parties involved: Ukraine, Europe, the United States, and Russia. There is no conceivable scenario in which Russia agrees to American or European boots on the ground, Western aircraft operating freely over Ukraine, and NATO-aligned naval forces in the Black Sea, all with an open-ended mandate to intervene in future conflicts defined by Ukraine itself. Such an arrangement would function as a one-sided Article 5 triggered unilaterally against Russia. From a position of strength, Russia has absolutely no incentive to legitimize the mechanisms that led to the war. Doing so would be strategic insanity. President Putin made this explicit yet again during his recent end-of-year press conference, a marathon event in which he reiterated what Russia has stated consistently since 2022. Russia is open to negotiations when the core issues are resolved. Those core issues have never changed: demilitarization, denazification, and Ukrainian neutrality, specifically, no NATO. What Keane and his allies propose is the exact reinsertion of all three of those rejected elements: a heavily militarized Ukraine, Western forces embedded on Russian borders, and NATO by proxy. This is not a misunderstanding. It is a deliberate act of bad faith. And Jack Keane is not alone. He is supported by figures deeply embedded in American political power, including Senator Lindsey Graham, a man whose statements increasingly border on outright madness. Graham recently declared that if Russia refuses to accept these self-destructive terms, the United States should dramatically change the game by supplying Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles to strike inside Russia, targeting missile and drone production facilities. This is not posturing. Graham openly stated he would go all in, end quote. That phrase alone should chill anyone who understands what it implies. What does all in mean when dealing with a nuclear power? American troops on the ground? American aircraft in combat? American ships engaged in hostilities? Direct war between nuclear-armed states? Graham seems untroubled by these questions. He appears to believe that a handful of long-range missiles would somehow bring Russia to its knees, compel submission, and force Moscow to accept terms it has already rejected from a position of dominance. This is fantasy. Worse, it is dangerous fantasy. Does anyone seriously believe Russia would simply absorb such strikes and do nothing? That it would respond with fear rather than force? That it would bend to the will of Washington politicians issuing threats from television studios? Russia is not threatened by the United States in any conventional sense, air, land, sea, space, or otherwise. And yet Graham openly advocates actions that would force Russia into direct confrontation. That is not defense. That is reckless escalation. What makes this situation even more alarming is the absence of serious pushback. Graham has repeatedly given platforms to promote these ideas with almost no challenge. Microphones are placed in front of him, and his calls for war are normalized as legitimate policy debate. This is not rhetoric to be dismissed. If acted upon, these ideas would cause immense harm, not just to others, but to the United States itself. The fact that Graham maintains personal influence with Donald Trump, a man known to be swayed by the last voice he hears, only heightens the risk. Graham has demonstrated influence before, including on matters involving Iran and the Middle East. There is a track record here, and it is not reassuring. Meanwhile, the broader diplomatic landscape offers no grounds for optimism. There is no realistic prospect for a negotiated settlement in the near term, precisely because Western actors continue to insist on conditions they know Russia will never accept. The gap between positions is not narrowing. It is widening. European governments persist in pursuing maximalist demands. Ukrainian leadership remains bound to external patrons who profit politically from prolongation. Russia, observing this reality, continues to prepare for a long war rather than a fraudulent peace. What we are witnessing is not diplomacy failing accidentally. It is diplomacy being deliberately wrecked. Those who claim to defend freedom, democracy, and free speech reveal the hollowness of those claims when confronted with inconvenient facts. Individuals who challenge the prevailing narrative are sanctioned, silenced, and financially punished, not because they are wrong, but because they are effective. Assets are frozen, travel is restricted, dissent is criminalized. This is the moral vacuum at the center of Western policy today. The war continues not because peace is impossible, but because peace has been made unacceptable by those who benefit from perpetual conflict. Until that reality is confronted honestly, any talk of negotiations will remain performative theater designed not to end the war, but to manage its optics while it grinds on. And that is where matters stand. And so we arrive at the hard, uncomfortable truth that many in Washington and Europe refuse to face. This war is not being prolonged by Russian intransigence, but by Western unwillingness to abandon fantasies of control. Peace is not elusive because Moscow is irrational. It is elusive because Western elites insist on outcomes that negate the very meaning of negotiation. They speak the language of diplomacy while sharpening knives behind their backs, demanding surrender wrapped in the vocabulary of security guarantees. History will not be kind to this moment. It will record that a real opportunity to stabilize Europe was sacrificed on the altar of hubris, careerism, and ideological obsession. Russia has stated its conditions clearly, consistently, and publicly. They are not secret, and they are not new. Ignoring them does not make them disappear. It only ensures that the battlefield, rather than the negotiating table, remains the final arbiter. Wars do not end because one side issues louder threats or supplies longer-range weapons. They end when reality asserts itself and illusions collapse. That reckoning is coming. The only remaining question is how much unnecessary destruction will precede it, and how many lives will be wasted before those who engineered this deadlock finally admit what should already be obvious. You cannot force a great power to accept its own strategic extinction and call it peace.